Now that you have a feel for how to navigate Tinkercad, let's get into lab number one. Again, what we're trying to do is replicate this in 3 dimensions. So I'm going to run you through how to do it. My hope is that as you're listening to this video, you're following along in another tab, you've got Tinkercad open, and you're giving this a go. So first step I'm going to do is before I even drag in a box, that was my mistake. First thing I want to do is I want to use the ruler tool. The reason why, in aviation, especially when you're doing weight and maintenance, which will be a unit you'll be doing later on, you want to have reference rulings. In aviation, we call it the datum. I'm going to set a datum to this work plane right here, so that way we know coordinates and we can get exact measurements. It's super important for what we're going to do here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to have you left click and hold the ruler tool, and I want you to drag it to this corner, the bottom left hand corner of the work plane. Notice how I'm scrolling in and zooming in using that center wheel. Again, it can't be off even by 1 square. It's got to be exact. So I'm going to make sure it's aligned to that corner and let it go. And what's going to happen, and it's really cool, let me drag in a box right now, go ahead and do it. What's going to happen is that it's going to tell me the location of that box relative to the datum, which is 0 in the x direction, 0 in the y direction, and 0 in the z direction. So notice how I move this around. These green arrows change with it. So right now it looks like I'm 30 millimeters away here, 30 millimeters away here, and if I take this top cone and move it up and down, you're going to notice that it even gives me how far I am from the work plane and from the datum in the z direction. So I'm going to undo that. Do Control Z if you want to undo anything. Super helpful. So now that you have a ruler set in place and you have a datum set in place, another thing that's really important, and I'm going to show you this over here, we need to change our settings. Currently everything is set to millimeters. I want to instead change it to inches. Inches will be the primary thing that we're going to be going with here. So I'm going to make inches my thing. I'm going to close the settings. And you're going to see over here that it says Snap Grid. It's currently set to 1/8 of an inch, which means whenever I click and drag this, it's going to move in increments of 1/8 of an inch. One of these squares, these little squares right here, is 1/8 of an inch by 1/8 of an inch. I want to change that because there are some parts in this video where we're going to need to be more precise than 1/8 of an inch. I think I have it down to 1/16 of an inch, but just to be extra precise, I'm going to set it to 1/32 of an inch. So I'm going to set my snap grid to 1/32 of an inch. And what it does is that instead of snapping to the squares, it allows me to move. Again, I'm left clicking and dragging at the same time. It allows me to move within a square, so I have even more precise and smaller measurements. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to drag, now that I've set up my box here, we need to get the dimensions. What I'm going to do is, instead of trying to do all of this at once, I'm going to start by creating a box that is the width, the height, and the depth of the entire piece without having this piece cut out or this hole cut out. I'm just going to do a giant rectangular prism here. So if my explanation's a little bit clumsy, the visual I think will more than compensate for it. So here's what I'm going to do. For my length, I'm going to have my length be 4 5/8, which in decimal form, which is what this is going to take, that's going to be 5/8 is 625. So that's going to give me, let me zoom out a little bit so you can get a better eagle eye view of what's going on here. So I have a block that's 4 5/8 inches long, and over here, the width is going to be 2 3/4 of an inch long, so that's 2.75. And then my thickness of the block according to this right here, if you zoom in and get a closer look at it, that says 7/8. So I'm going to make this 7/8, which is 0.875. So now that I have the rectangular prism that I'm going to start with, I'm going to click it. And what I want to do is I want to set this to be exactly at my 0 point. So you could try to drag it over here. What you may find is that you drag it and it may not be 100%. It may not be 100% accurate. You see the green arrows? That means you're not on the datum here. So I'm just going to type in, click on the green arrow and change the number to 0 here. And I'm going to change my number to 0 right here. And this is going to get me square on the datum. So now I have my box. I know my box is on the datum. And my snap settings are good. So now this is where things get interesting. What's going to happen is that I'm going to take the rest of this drawing in 2 steps. The first thing I want to do is I want to cut out this chunk right here, and then I want to cut out my hole over here. So I'm going to start by cutting out this chunk. And in order to cut out this chunk, what I'm going to need to do, and I'm going to get back to my shapes over here. You notice how we dragged in a box before? This right here is also a box, but notice how it has this like hatch look to it. This box has a special feature to it. It's actually called a hole. And what happens is that if I drag it in, and I'm going to drag one in right here, with this special hatch feature, and again, sorry, it's taking me a second to get my view to look nice. Okay, that looks better. What happens here is that this acts as a hole. So just to show you in advance what's going to happen, if I drag this over here and then merge the shapes together, what's going to happen is that a hole that is basically going to appear that looks exactly like that cube. So our job here is I'm going to undo what I just did here. Scroll back out. Our job here is to make a hole. Excuse me, I totally made a mistake here. Let me get back in. What you're going to see is I want to make a hole that replicates this opening in my part. So in order to do that, I need to get the dimensions, and you can read it off the drawing, and you can see that the dimensions of my hole, I have 1 7/8 in width. It's still 2 3/4 in depth. And then my height, if I take a look over here, is 7/16, and you can also see that, yeah, no, that's where you can see it right there. So it's going to be 7/16. So 1 7/8 by 2 3/4 by 7/16. So let's change my settings over here on the block so that way it reflects that. I'm going to make an adjustment here. I'm going to make my height a 1/16 taller than what was originally written because that's going to help me in being able to make the cut. I'm going to make my y-axis a 1/16 taller. So let's take a look over here. So here's what that's going to look like. I want my length to be 1 7/8, which is 1.875. I'm going to type that in over here. I want my width, which I'm going to click on this number right here to change it. And I'm going to change it to 2.8125. That's 2 13/16 for your information. So that's 2.8125. That's 1/16 above the 3/4 in the drawing, and that's going to allow me to more effectively make the hole. So I have that, and then my thickness, I need to adjust to be 7/16, which is 0.4, well, if I can type it right, 4375. And now I have the hole. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to drag it, and this is where my green arrows are going to come super handy. Instead of having you struggle through this, I'm going to give you the coordinates. So for my x coordinate, you need to move that to 0.875. In your y direction, which is this over here, I'm going to click it, and you want to move that to negative 0.0625. That's negative 1/16. That's going to get it out of the page a little bit. It helps it protrude a little better. And then in the z direction, which right now on my view is this number right here. We don't want this to be flush to the ground. We want it to actually flush this top surface, which means we need to move this up a little bit to make that happen. And again, you can drag the cone by doing that, but to get a precise measurement, you want this to be 0.4375. You do that, it gets flush with the surface. Let me double check and make sure everything's looking fine. Awesome. So then, you're gonna, to select both of these, you're going to left click and hold, and you're gonna see a red selection box appear. You're gonna drag it over both your pieces, and it's gonna select both of them. And then you have this awesome tool here called Group or Merge. And what's gonna do is that it's gonna merge the solid with the hole that you made. And now, we're almost there. We've made this hole right here. Now the final thing that we need to make is this hole in the piece right here. So let me show you how to do that. So what's going to happen here is that you're going to drag in another hole, but instead of it being a box hole, you have an option here for a cylinder hole. Fantastic tool. So you're going to drag it in over here. And you're going to need to resize this just a little bit in order for it to fit the dimensions of the box. You're going to notice here that your diameter of the cylinder is 1 inch. We want to keep it that way because according to my information here, the hole is going to be 1 inch. But what I'm going to do here, and again, you have your Z dimensions, you have your X dimensions and your Y dimensions here. I'm going to change my Z dimension to be 15/16. So that's 0.9375. So now that I have my cylinder, or the hole that I'm going to make here, the right size, we need to move this exactly where it needs to be. You're going to see this little box right here. This is, again, how much height you have in the Z direction. Right now, don't mess with it. Keep it at 0. And then we need to change these green arrows over here to move this hole exactly to where it needs to be. Instead of making you struggle through making the calculations, I'm just going to tell you the numbers right here. In the X direction, we want the hole to be at coordinate 3.1875 in the X direction. So that's going to get it centered on this rectangular piece right here. And then in the Y direction, we want this to be at 0.875. So it is centered on my block right here. Again, like before, you're going to left click, do your selection box, left click and drag. And then you merge, and you have yourself in 3 dimensions the exact thing that you created here on paper in the previous lab. I hope this is super helpful to you. I can't wait to see you in the next lab. Clancy over and out.